Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
Historian Martha S. Jones was looking through a book one day when she found a section mentioning her grandfather. But there was a problem with that passage. It referred to her grandfather as white. In reality, her great-grandfather was a free man of color, and her great-grandmother was born enslaved. It wasn't the first time her family's racial identity was questioned, but it struck her personally. People made assumptions about her grandfather just like they made assumptions about her. That was when she first started writing down her family's history, and it was her way of better understanding her own relationship with racial identity and the color lines that people create. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking with Martha S. Jones about her family history and what it can teach us about racial identity in the U.S. Martha S. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and Professor at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Her latest book is The Trouble of Color, an American Family Memoir. Martha, welcome to Disrupted.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to talk about this book. I'm excited to talk about your journey in writing this book, particularly in this moment where so many of us need to be reminded of history, of context, and how it can shape how we move forward in understanding one another. The introduction for this book, you quote W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. And that line reads, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." Share with our listeners your decision to start there with the words of Du Bois.
Well, of course, Du Bois is writing at the dawn of the 20th century and is nothing short of prophetic in anticipating the way in which Americans on so many registers are going to be confronted with, grappling with, inventing what we come to think of as the color line. I wanted to rethink Du Bois's idea a bit through my own family history and began to stretch that metaphor to term it the jagged color line. And here, wanting to emphasize that in our history, the color line has never been a sure or a clear or the definitive dividing line between Black and white Americans at all, that our lives have always been intimate and intertwined. But for those of us who approach the color line, who cross the color line, who confound the color line, it is a dangerous place. And part of my story is a story about how individuals are harmed, how they are wounded in encounters with the color line.
One of the reasons that the color line can be so harmful is that it's not just about how we see ourselves or how our families see us and each other. It is often about how other people see us, how they label us, and the harm that can happen, the really lifelong harm that can happen when there's a disconnect between that self-identity, self-experience, and that social identity. You write in the book about a classmate asking you, "Who do you think you are?" and the ways that that was jarring for you. Share that experience with our listeners.
It's 1976. So I'm taking you back. I'm a first year in college. It's my first time away from home on my own. It's my first time outside of a world where people knew me, who knew us. And I become a Black Studies minor. But I am, just to play the color metaphor, I am green, as we say. And there's a great deal I don't know, which is why I'm there. And we make oral reports. I stand up in front of the room to present on the now classic A Dying Colonialism by Frantz Fanon. I know very little about the book or its context. And as I begin to speak, a classmate stands up and, in essence, denounces me and challenges my presence, challenges my capacity to understand the work, to speak, even in that modest setting, on behalf of Fanon. And I realize that he is looking at me, and he sees fair skin, he sees limp hair, he hears my suburban New York accent, and he's not sure that someone like me should be part of the Black Studies experience.
To have that experience in such a public way. And we all remember that sort of early years when we were in college of trying to figure out our place. Who are we separate from who we've always been, who we've been to our family, our neighborhood, that constant concern that I'm going to do or say something that will brand me as different or not a part of the collective. But to have that in such a vocal way, particularly in that kind of class. I'm curious, Martha, how that kind of experience, was that something you had experienced before, or was it the very public, indicting nature of it that made it stick with you in a different way?
You know, as a young person, I think like most of us, I had known teasing and being called out and being called names. But I think I imagined that going to college was a kind of do-over, right? And you got to leave that all behind and that childishness behind, the schoolyard behind. And now we were becoming the serious young people, the young adults we aspired to be. And that, in a sense, I could be who I believed I was, who I wanted to be. And there's no question, but that classmate's challenge unsettled me deeply. But what he was telling me was that welcome to the adult world, right? Where there are new stakes for us in who we are and who we think we are and how folks perceive us. And he, I think, not because he was intending to be generous, but unwittingly, I think he introduced a new kind of question that I think is, in some sense, still part of my sense of self even today.
You know, I've always had lots of questions about my own family, our own history, our identities, the complicated ways that those things interconnect. And so for Christmas last year, my aunt's gift to me was this collection of family photos and letters. And she said, it's time to tell the story. And I will admit, Martha, I am afraid to open this box fully because in investigating your family story, it's not just about you telling it. It's also forcing other people to confront some of those parts that they may have buried or thought, we just don't discuss that. Tell me about your decision to explore your family story and to bring that into the form of a memoir to say, yes, this is our history, but this is also, as the title says, an American family memoir.
You're right that you open that cache of letters, or you begin to rifle through those photographs, and you begin to see how everyone has a story to tell. And part of the challenge as we sit in the 21st century and we are ourselves becoming those family storytellers is, who are we in relationship to the stories that have been told before us? And my decision was to not come in to correct my ancestors or to set a record straight. I came to understand that they told the stories that they needed to tell in their own time, right? This is a book that begins with enslaved ancestors ancestors who go through the Civil War and make their way to freedom, ancestors who survive Jim Crow, passing anti-miscegenation laws. I'm not wholly positioned, right, to tell them that the way they understood themselves and the way they told that family story for others, including in officialdom, was not the way to tell the story, and that I could tell my version of that story, but I would have to do it alongside them. And I think in this sense, this was a way of grappling with what is sometimes the fraught tenor of invoking the American story, right? Which is to say, the American story is filled with conflict and contradictions and difference and much more. And I think for me, it was most important to understand why people told the stories that they did, even if I would ultimately tell the story differently, as a way of a kind of reconciliation, right? Right. That all those stories are true, right? In the way that family stories are true, right? There is no capital T truth here to be discovered, I don't think. It is for me, it has been for me a kind of reconciliation with the past, even the very difficult past. And that is perhaps feels today like a overly ambitious objective, but I still think that that reconciliation is something I aspire to.
Coming up, more with historian Martha S. Jones. She's author of The Trouble of Color, an American family memoir. She'll tell us about a relative who was once arrested for sitting in a section of the Opera House reserved for white patrons, and why she sees parallels between that relative's experiences and her own. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're exploring racial identity and belonging through one family story. Martha S. Jones is a historian at Johns Hopkins University. She's author of The Trouble of Color, an American family memoir. In the book, Martha writes about two family members, Mary and Elijah Jones. They were married in 1827. I asked her to tell us more about those relatives. And a note for our listeners, there's a brief discussion of abuse.
Mary and Elijah really open up new worlds for me, because in 1827, they marry across that jagged color line. Mary is a so-called white woman. Elijah is a so-called man of color. And in order to get a license and make a family, live a long life together, they have to trick the eyes of court clerks and census takers. For me, the story it has its own extraordinary worth, because it is a story of survival, as you say, and about how we survive. But for me, more personally, I had been raised to think that in our long family saga, my parents, who had been married 150 years later in 1957, 130 years later, I had been raised to believe that my parents were the first to have crossed the color line to wed. And it turns out that wasn't true. I think I say somewhere in the book, it turns out it was a family tradition of sorts. It was not as illicit in 1957 as it was in 1827, but it was still illegal in my father's home state of North Carolina for a so-called black and so-called white person to marry. So today that makes me smile in a way, and because I think that I had lived with the kind of denigration of my parents and the branding of them as, out of line, out of step, out of keeping, maybe by some measures, but not by our family measure. Mary and Elijah had, in their own way, traveled that same journey in central North Carolina, even before the Civil War.
I notice you use the term so-called Black and so-called white, which to me speaks to the porous nature of those terms and those categories, the ways that it varies based on place. So how someone may have been characterized in North Carolina would have been different from how someone is characterized in Florida. And yet those categories and classifications still carry meaning and weight. You also share in this book the story about your family possibly being related to John Jacob Astor. What was the significance of that connection or possible connection for your family?
So my family is hardly the first to claim some kind of blood connection to, Thomas Jefferson. Choose your outstanding figure from the past. And so there was a story that had been told by my great grandmother, Jenny, and had been passed down. Everybody liked it because it was humorous. It seemed fanciful, but she had told it enough that we didn't forget it. And for me, I had to ask, why go back to this story one more time? And I thought, if I'm going to go back to this story, I'm going to take it seriously and believe Jenny long enough to do the research and try and wrap my mind around how it was that she, born in Eastern North Carolina, to an enslaved woman, might have been the great-granddaughter of John Jacob Astor, her mother, the granddaughter of John Jacob Astor. And I don't have much to go on. Astor was a real estate and fur magnate, a fur trader magnate in New York City. I had no reason to think he'd ever been to Eastern North Carolina. But I begin to, as we do, I read slave narratives, I read newspaper accounts, and folks will have to read it to see if I persuade you. But that piece of the book reflects the kind of ethics that I wanted to bring to this, which is that rather than treat Jenny's story like an amusing, flight of fancy, I really wanted to say, it actually is possible. And there's some interesting evidence that might lead us to begin to connect the dots. And then most importantly, to appreciate that Jenny had been a child of her own mother, Isabella, and a father who claimed her as property. And why wouldn't you reach for John Jacob Astor as the way you tell your own story? I understood why that was the story she would reach for, rather than the story of her own father, who had been a violent man who had abused her mother and abandoned her and her siblings after the Civil War. I think I understand her better now for taking that story seriously.
That reach becomes so significant for how people imagine, reason, and work through extremely difficult times that to other people may make no sense. But if you are faced with your own father viewing you as property, as something that is an asset to be sold, then it means that you see your worth and your connection in a very different way. This is a book, Martha, that, unlike many other memoirs, seems intentional about telling the stories of women, because those experiences of women were often quite different. But the nuance of that and what they went through to survive and to have some quality of life, I think often gets overlooked in some other works in the telling. You share the story in the book of your great grandmother, Fannie Miller Williams, who was once arrested for sitting in a section at the Opera House that was designated for white people only. Tell us about Fannie Miller Williams.
Fannie is probably the character in this book I was most afraid of, in a way, because she's among the most transgressive. And the example that you point to is just one of the ways in which she takes the confidence she earns. She's our first college graduate. She graduates from Berea College in Kentucky in the 1880s. She is, by all accounts, brilliant. She becomes an educator, and she believes in the brotherhood of man, which is to say, she believes herself as worthy as any individual to sit in an opera seat and in a seat in an opera house, and a great deal more. I had once told that story as an example of, the rise of Jim Crow, right, and segregation. And I had characterized gently Fannie as a victim. But the more I got to know her, the more it became clear that there was very little about Fannie that was about victimhood. She was defiant, and she sat in the seat that pleased her. And later in her life, when she chose to go to the movies or to shop in a department store, she used her light skin to trick the eyes of clerks and ticket takers, just like she had tried to trick the ushers in that theater as a young person. And I think for her, it was that embodiment of what it means to live by way of this brotherhood of man creed. And it was also a little bit thumbing her nose at the structures and the authorities of Jim Crow, who would have relegated her to one place or another. I suspect Fannie was a woman who, particularly when she moved in places with some anonymity, might just be ordinarily regarded as a white woman. And she frightened me in a sense because that experience really parallels my own. And I think it's a dilemma I live with until today. On what days and under what circumstances and by what means do you announce to a ticket taker or to a clerk or the usher in the theater that you are not what you appear to be? Fannie had one, I think, worldview about that. Mine might be another, but I think we share that dilemma.
You mentioned when you announce to the world, and I imagine it's also a question of, should I have to? Should it be ever? Can I just be me? What you just said has me wondering, Martha, what did writing this memoir, this history of your family, what did it teach you about yourself?
The first thing it taught me was that many facets of myself, many of the dilemmas that I associate with my own years are really old. And that I truly, every character in this book, I feel they are a part of me quite literally. And so, of course, we as we do, right, we speak of our indelible relations to ancestors, but now I could name for you person after person and the qualities that I carry that I now recognize are inherited qualities. And that's just a powerful other kind of foundation for who I am. I think that the book has given me a kind of courage. I hope in this book that I have been frank enough, as I think we do as memoirists and family storytellers, frank enough that there are very few stories that you can tell on me any longer because I think I've told them and tried to understand them and tried to really bring you into a conversation about the things you might wonder about me or the questions you might have about me. But the most important thing is that I have a sense of humor, and I did not expect that. I think that, the history of race in America is so morbidly serious, and yet it is also absurd. It is just littered with absurdity. And I think for me, finally, the absurdity, the sheer falsehood of race is now on the tip of my tongue, if you will. And that's new for someone like me, who was mostly filled with pathos most of my life, I'll be frank. And now I see it for the absurd, twisted, as my friend Jelani Cobb says, right? The lie, right? And it's a lie. It's a pernicious lie, but it's a lie. And I really had never been able to sit at a distance from that story.
That was historian Martha S. Jones, author of The Trouble of Color, an American family memoir. Coming up, Martha connects her family story with today's arguments about birthright citizenship. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking with historian Martha S. Jones about her family history and what it tells us about racial identity in the U.S. Her new book is The Trouble of Color, an American family memoir. In the book, Martha writes about a meeting between her grandmother and the groundbreaking scholar, Dr. Murs Tate. Murs Tate was an expert on international relations, and she taught at Howard University for 3 decades. She was the first Black woman to earn a PhD in government from Harvard University. Ask Martha to tell us more about that meeting. And later in the conversation, we talk a bit about Wesleyan University, where I work as a professor and executive director of the Albritton Center for the Study of Public Life.
Dr. Murs Tate had taught early in her career at Bennett College, where my grandfather, David Jones, had been president then of what is still today a small Black women's liberal arts school, Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina. And if you know anything about Bennett, you should know that it is a very intimate place. And so my grandparents lived on the campus, and my grandfather knew every student by name. It was that kind of place. And so they knew Dr. Tate well. But she went on, as you say, to have an illustrious career, most of it spent at Howard University. And she came back to Bennett in 1977 to interview my grandmother, who was then, I guess, in her late 70s, or no, must have been in her 80s by then, for a Black Women's Oral History project that was being sponsored by Harvard's Schlesinger Library. So this is a reunion of 2 women who know each other well, but a lot has transpired since they were first together on the Bennett campus in those early years of the college. And Dr. Tate's charge is to help my grandmother move through the narrative of her own life. And that oral history, the recording and the transcription and the photographs that go with it are all at the Schlesinger Library, and I was able to access them, but anybody can today online. But the critical moment for me is when Dr. Tate and my grandmother begin to look through family photographs, and Dr. Tate comes across 3 photos, remember the school portraits of myself, my brother, and my sister. And she is interested. She is intrigued. I think she is slightly provoked by the images. I think she knows the backstory. I think she knows who our parents are. And she and my grandmother get into an awkward back and forth as Dr. Tate tries to prompt my grandmother to label us. And I think in 1977, there is no polite label by my grandmother's terms. And I take it no polite label by Dr. Tate's terms because she doesn't offer one. And it's a stunning moment, I think, because it's clear that it's 10 years after Loving versus Virginia. Anti-miscegenation laws have been wiped away by a Supreme Court decision. But this question, even this dilemma about how to term the children of those interracial marriages is really, we're just at the beginning of that question. Nobody is going to call us mulattoes in 1977 in my grandmother's version of polite conversation. We don't yet have the terms we might use today, like mixed race or multiracial. And so it captures, I think, in real time where those women were and how it was a very important question to them, and yet it was one they really couldn't figure out how to answer. My grandmother, having lived not only with us, but coming from a family where many people had born children across the color line. She didn't have language. Dr. Tate, the great social scientist, right, and colleague to some of the, the luminaries in Black political science and Black sociology, she being a historian, she too doesn't have the words. And so we see them in real time wrestling with the dilemmas that are run through the book.
You mentioned your grandfather, Dr. David Jones, who, as you said, was president of Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina, who had such an amazing legacy, not just as president of Bennett, but more broadly of someone who said, I have this opportunity. I'm going to create opportunities for generations of young women to then have an impact on their communities, their families, that kind of leadership, particularly in the time that he was leading, and to be able to transform Bennett and create a legacy for others. There is also a bit of a Connecticut connection related to your grandfather as well. Share that connection with our listeners.
Yeah. I'm pleased to, because my grandfather had the good fortune and really with the guidance of a much older brother, the character in this book who's called the Bishop. His older brother took him out of Greensboro, right? Took him out of the segregated, violent South to New Orleans, a complicated place, but a place where he could be educated as a young person, and then sent him to no place less than Wesleyan University. And that experience at Wesleyan is transformative for my grandfather and for his future, because he makes relationships at Wesleyan with men who will themselves go on to be leading lights in higher education across the United States. They will become his allies in the building and the remaking of Bennett College in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, a time where, the president of an HBCU had to have many kinds of assets, but one of them was connections to elite higher education circles in the North, to philanthropic circles in the North. And his years at Wesleyan really permitted him to step into that role with, as we used to say, a Rolodex filled with men he had met who were now leading institutions all over the United States. It was an essential component of who he became.
as I'm listening to you thinking about your grandfather and your grandmother, because I don't think people realize, especially at an historically Black college, especially at a women's college, the key role that a quote unquote first lady plays. Because in some ways, they are a hedge of protection for their husband or the leader of whatever the institution is. They become a bridge builder to others, students, their families, funders, and play such a critical role. And so that legacy of two people who said, we believe in the power of education. We believe that education is a way of actually carrying out that purpose of being in this country. And I'm thinking, Martha, you and I both work on college campuses. I'm thinking about all the attacks that we're seeing right now, all the questions that we're seeing, that many of the questions we thought had long been settled are now reemerging. One of those questions that you have written about so beautifully is this concept of birthright citizenship. You have a 2018 book called Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America. How does your concept of what birthright citizenship has meant throughout U.S. history, how should we be thinking about this now as we are seeing the ways it's being politicized to target and exclude people for whom, again, we thought this had long been settled?
I'm going to take us back to Mary and Elijah Jones for a moment. It's 1827. We're in the Piedmont of North Carolina in a community called Little Texas. Elijah is, as I described him, a free man of color. What does that mean in 1827? Well, it means too little, because in the long years leading up to the Civil War, Black Americans like Elijah are, to many minds, understood to be less than citizens of the United States. Less than citizens, which means they are subjected to Black laws, discriminatory laws, and have no remedy before courts or before the Constitution. What does it mean? It means they are the targets of a colonization movement that would remove them wholesale from the United States and relocate them to places like West Africa's Liberia, a colony created to remove and cleanse the United States of people of African descent. So we, Black Americans, even today, have a deep stakes in the birthright citizenship question. Even those of us who are born in the U.S. may blithely assume that we are citizens of the United States, but we owe it to the generations of Elijah and people like him who fought for that, ultimately to have that principle constitutionalized. If I could just, for a moment, bring it to the present, I want to draw one more parallel, which is that today, the proposed abrogation of birthright, the exclusion of children born to so-called unauthorized immigrants, is a move that asks families to bear the burden of our public policy, of our constitutional interpretation, of our immigration policy, and threatens and is already dividing families. For Black Americans, we must not forget, as I tell the story of my great-great-grandmother, Susan Davis, who just before the Civil War has 3 children. She's held a slave. The woman who owns her, quote unquote, dies. And now she faces the separation of herself from her children. That threat of separation is part of our history too, because one of slavery's most cruel consequences was the arbitrary separation of families by law. So I want us to appreciate that we reached for citizenship a long time ago, right? to affirm our place in this country and our belonging, to secure our families and the well-being of our families, especially our children. And today we are watching people take that principle and pervert it to undo the lives of other Americans, our neighbors, our friends, our classmates, in the name of the Constitution.
You know, right after the election, a lot of people asked me, are you leaving? Are you going to leave the United States? Are you going somewhere else? Do you feel like this is a place where you can be safe for the kind of scholarship that I do, the family that I'm a part of? Are you leaving? And my question, Martha, my response was always, why? You know, I am the granddaughter of a grandfather who had to drop out of school in 6th grade because his father passed away. And as the youngest boy, the only one still at home, had to go help his family and help his mother. That red clay in Virginia that, you know, is where I grew up, we poured into that soil. I know what it meant for my elders to be able to sacrifice so that I could have the kind of education that I have now. And my fear is that so many people don't grasp that history or don't grasp the true fight for citizenship. At the time that you and I are having this conversation, it is marking the 60th anniversary of the Bloody Sunday March. And for me to have been there on that bridge at the 50th anniversary and to see John Lewis on one side of the bridge and Barack Obama on the other, that's the essence of citizenship. That however people are labeled, whatever pathways that they take, the idea that a family can hold itself together is critical. And to me, is why this is an American family memoir, because it holds together all of those pieces. Given all of that, how do you respond to people who say, given the directors of the White House, given all of the ways that it looks like Congress has become complicit in some of this harm, there are many people who say, there's no need to fight. It's a done deal. What do you say in response to that?
You know, for me, it turns out this book was an essential gathering up of the ancestors. We always need the ancestors, but I think in this moment more so than ever. And what I know is that Elijah Jones did not pick up and go to Liberia. You know, I think he subscribed to the view that Martin Delany, the great abolitionist journalist, offered, and that you echoed just a moment ago, right? This is our home. This is where we went to school. This is where we have toiled. This is where our parents are buried. And we are not going to abandon that willingly, ever. We are going to insist on belonging. And I think in the 21st century, insist on belonging for ourselves and the belonging of others, right? Others who have, in their own ways, right, made themselves a part of the fabric of this nation, that we are bound to them also. I too meet people and hear folks, you know, who are ready to go. I don't know another place. And when you remind me of a place like Bennett College, Bennett is Black land. There is in that soil are not merely, you know, the nutrients that, you know, permit the magnolia trees to blossom, or the foundations that hold up the dormitories and the chapel, right? It is the blood and the sweat and the joy and the laughter. All of that is absorbed in this land. And if you at all speak with folks who are exiled or refugees, they will tell you they live haunted, right, by the dream of return. And so everyone will have to make the choices they can and the choices they will in this time. But I think that we know enough about the exile and the refugee experience to know, even Baldwin, right? Even Baldwin returned. Right? It's to say that if this is your home, we're all asking ourselves, what are we willing to do? What are we able to do? What must we do to insist on that? And when I travel, I meet many more people who are recommitting to their place, to our place, to our collective place here, frankly, than I am meeting folks who are packing up for, parts unknown.
Right before we started our formal conversation, Martha, we were talking about your book tour and the work that you're doing, not just promoting this book, but you're really promoting conversation and connection. What are you hearing as you are in conversation with other people and they're coming to be a part of a gathering? What are you hearing?
Well, I'm very much hearing, as I said, other folks, collecting up the ancestors, right? And we're using family stories to be reminded of, what I think was one of Kamala Harris's really powerful refrains, right? That we have so much more in common, so much more unites us than that which divides us. And so it turns out that our ability to tell our family stories reminds us also that the lines between us that have been, written in law, have written in social science, have been written by many people outside of our lives, really don't hold. I met last night the young women whose one parent is a Catholic German immigrant, and the other is, a patrician New England WASP Protestant. And that is a complicated story, as mine is a complicated story. And on the other hand, it is a story that they embody and that they live with. And it is a story that defies these simplistic and threadbare notions of how we can be separated by boxes and categories. And so I'm incredibly inspired by who we are individually and who we are collectively. And I think in a time where politics is hard to talk about, family gives us a way to have those conversations in a deep and meaningful way, even if I never learn who you voted for in 2024.
Well, we are so grateful that you are reminding us of the language of family and the language of connection that I firmly believe will carry us through if we are willing to listen and willing to gather. Martha S. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and Professor at the SNF Agora Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. Her latest book is The Trouble of Color, an American Family Memoir. Thank you so much, Martha.
Thank you so much.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Meg Fitzgerald, and Meg Dalton. Our interns are Angelica Gajewski and Kathy Wang. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcasts. And you can listen to new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown Dean. Thanks for listening.